I've been very, very lucky. I suppose we should say blessed rather than lucky. We don't believe in luck. Anyway, I've been very lucky or blessed to have visited some of the scenes that we've been hearing about in the scriptures today, and particularly to have followed the story of St. Peter's life through the geography and the archaeology, just in some of the visits I've had at seminary and since I was a priest. So some of you remember me coming back from my trip to the Holy Land 2 years ago and saying that one of the places we visited was on the shore of the Lake of Galilee, where Jesus would have called the fisherman, Peter, today. The spot where almost certainly these men would have plied their trade, have brought their fish ashore, and you might just think this is kind of speculation. Oh yes, in these rough 2 miles, this is where they did some fishing. But actually, there are particular spots where the fishermen used to come in. And archaeologists have discovered some steps down from the shoreline into the sea from this 1st century, going back 2,000 years. So a set of steps that very, very possibly Jesus could have walked up and down. Peter and Andrew and James and John would have gone up and down daily in their fishing, and that you can wander around there, paddle in the sea, and pray at the altar that's been built just above that site. This is where things began for Peter, an ordinary man doing his work, living with his family, being called by the Lord. And then into Jerusalem and all the events, not to summarise them, but just we've heard in the Acts of the Apostles today about Peter going boldly to preach in Jerusalem. These are the events where Peter was a transformed man. This is the man who was so frightened after what had happened. He'd lost his confidence, and in the power of the Holy Spirit he is there proclaiming the risen Jesus to the good and the great of Jerusalem. And then it was in prophecy in the Gospel today. We haven't heard about it happening, but Jesus prophesying Peter's martyrdom. And us knowing through our faith and through our history that somewhere around the site of the Vatican, very near to St. Peter's Basilica today, in that area, almost certainly, this is the place where Peter gave his life 35 years later. The journey that had taken him from obscurity in Galilee to the great preacher of the Christian faith in Jerusalem, to the man who gives his life in martyrdom a few years later in the city of Rome. And for us to see this story in a pattern that I hope might be helpful. Because when you think about Christian conversion, at the beginning you might think it's quite tidy. Yes? I'm living an ordinary life, I hear about Jesus, my life is converted, and I live for him and my life is changed. It's very rare that it happens like that. Because for Peter, he went from ordinariness to enthusiasm, great, then to failure, and then to grace. That's the pattern of St. Peter's life. And actually, it's much more common for most of us, especially the longer you live. He's an ordinary man. He's not expecting to meet Jesus. He's not expecting this call. He's a fisherman. He's got friends, a business, a family. St. Peter on the shore of Galilee. And yes, Jesus calls him and asks him to follow him. And yes, this is a moment of conversion, right at the beginning of the Gospel. You've heard this so many times. It's not the Gospel we heard today. It's the beginning of the Gospel. The fishermen are called, and we think, wow, they're becoming disciples, they're becoming apostles. Their Christian life is beginning, which it is. But all of this enthusiasm, we can see with hindsight, is under their own energies. Wow, I've met Jesus. I'm going to do great things for him. I'm going to follow him. I'm going to change the world. Peter is such an energetic, enthusiastic man. This is his plan. I found my guru, Jesus, and with his help, I am going to change the world. Peter's the one who jumps into the sea to walk on water. He's the one who professes his faith. He's the one who says, I will die for you, Lord. Do you see the enthusiasm and the energy? And from the outside, you would say, what a marvellous Christian, wouldn't you? And he is. And he does many great things in the ministry of Jesus in Galilee and going to Jerusalem. This is Jesus' public ministry. It's the beginnings of the church, and it's the beginnings of Peter's Christian life. But it all comes crashing down in the time of the Passion. Peter, this strongest of disciples, he's the one who denies and abandons Jesus. You remember what we read in the Passion narrative. When Jesus is taken to be tortured and crucified, when the beloved disciple is staying close to him, when the women are there faithfully at the foot of the cross, Peter in the courtyard with the servant girl asking him questions and the fire burning, Peter is the one who denies him 3 times, and then the cock crows. And he goes out into the darkness, not with Jesus, but walking away from him. All this bravado, all the great things they've done, and all this image he's built up of himself as this great Christian, it comes crashing down, and he's a broken man. This is Peter. And in fact, the gospel that we've heard today, it's all about Jesus building Peter up again, but building him up in grace. That Peter has learnt humility. He's truly learnt his own weakness. And that by himself he can do nothing. He'd heard Jesus say that many times before, including at the Last Supper. But Peter has experienced this for himself. That by his own efforts he can do nothing, ultimately. And this beautiful encounter on the same lake shore with Jesus and Peter and the other disciples is about Jesus helping to build up Peter in grace so that he can truly do his work and build his kingdom. There's such tenderness in Jesus. He's there making breakfast on the shore. He calls to the fishermen and he helps them. He gives them advice. You've been looking there, look over here, and the great haul of fish. He invites them to bring the fish. He shares a meal with them, a symbol of the Eucharist. And then, as we've just heard and we know so well, he questions Peter about whether he truly loves him and whether he's willing to feed his sheep. You can read this in 2 ways. You can partly think this is Jesus helping Peter to face his own 3-fold failure. He denied him 3 times, and to say yes again 3 times. He's giving Peter a chance to recognise what's gone wrong and to know that he is still loved and that he has a 2nd, a 3rd, a 4th chance, and that as long as he stays close to the Lord, nothing can go wrong. So it's about Jesus' tenderness to Peter, his human psychology and his understanding, realising that Peter in himself needs to face what's gone wrong and own it and come back to the Lord and say, it's going to be different this time because I'm going to do it with you in your strength and not just in my own strength. So it's about Jesus' sensitivity to Peter. And for you to know this is what the Lord is like with you. The failures that you've experienced, the mistakes that you've made, never let them hold you back. Whatever has happened to you, whatever you have done to others, whatever mistakes you've made or sins you've committed, imagine yourself in Peter's position, who's almost too afraid to go back to the Lord. But thank God he does. Thank God he jumps off the boat into the water and goes to meet him. Never let your fear or your shame hold you back from coming to know the Lord's love. And this is part of Jesus' tenderness. But I think there's another reason that Jesus asks Peter the question 3 times, it's because he wants to make sure he's ready. This is an interview. Many of you going for job interviews at the moment. Most of you doing examinations. This is Jesus' interview. He's not just doing this as a psychologist to help Peter. Jesus is doing this to make sure that Peter is going to be able to do what he's asked to do. To lead the church. To preach the gospel in Jerusalem. To give his life in martyrdom in Rome. Are you really ready to do that? Jesus is saying implicitly. And the only way I'll know that you're ready to do that is if I know that you truly love me. I don't need to know that you're great. I don't need to hear you tell me all the wonderful things you're going to do for me. I just need to know that you truly, truly love me. And if I know that, then I know that everything else will be okay. And if it's difficult, that we can work it out as we go along. So this conversation is about Jesus' tenderness for Peter and for you. I hope you can see that. And it's also about Jesus' honesty with Peter and with you. You want to do great things for yourself. You want to do great things for me, says Jesus. You don't need to have 1,000 skills, you don't need to do lots of preparation, probably, but you do need to love me and to trust me. And the symbol of all this is the net of fish. This enormous net. Peter gaining nothing in the night, but then when he listens to Jesus and casts the net out to the starboard, a catch of fish so big that they can't even bring it into the boat. 153 fish. Now we could spend 7 hours on this, yeah? Why 153 fish? Why does John say there were 153 fish? The first answer is, maybe there were 153 fish. Yeah? It's a rule of scripture interpretation. You go for the first literal, logical answer first of all. So let's just assume that. St. John says there were 153 fish. I'm sure they counted them. They were so amazed by them, they wanted to tell the story afterwards. They wanted bragging rights. Okay. But there's lots of symbolism there. Maybe 153 also means just a vast number. You just pick a random huge number. Okay. Maybe it means, this is one interpretation, that at that period zoologists had catalogued fish into 153 types. So it was a symbol of all the fishness of the world. The great fish of the oceans, here they all are. But I also read another theory that at that time the zoologists were cataloguing 153 different animal species. You see? So I need you to go and do your scientific history and tell me what the correct answer is. But there's definitely something here about abundance and universality and munificence and greatness and largeness, and that the net isn't broken. So that this great richness and diversity is held together in St. Peter's net. Ah, do you see the symbolism? Yeah. Peter, to be a fisher of men, to be a fisher of human beings, with the other disciples, to gather the nations into the church, to reach out to all people and all nations and all tribes, but to keep them united in the one family of Jesus Christ, the one church of Jesus Christ. So that when Peter dies in Rome, 35 years later, he's not just dying as an individual saint. He's dying as the one who stands for the unity of the Catholic Church. And that Christians, from that point onwards, when they looked to the Church of Rome, where Peter and Paul gave their lives, looked for that sense of belonging and unity that was the guarantee that they were living their faith at the heart of Christ's church, and connected them with that fire and that Eucharistic meal at the Lake of Galilee that Easter morning. So take Peter as a friend today. He's given to us on this third Sunday of Easter by the church to be a model, a friend. Learn from him that we need to be converted. Wonderful. We need to be enthusiastic, energetic. But if and when we reach the limits of our own efforts, and if, I don't wish this upon you, but through life in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, if you experience failure even in your faith, and even of the kind that crushes you so deeply you think you can't start again, that's the moment, perhaps, when your Christian life is truly about to begin. Because it's the moment when you come, maybe for the first time, to the Lord and say, Lord, I actually can't do this on my own. I can only do it in the strength of your power and with the assurance of your love. And I can't say anything else. I can't make any promises other than to say, I love you. And if you can say that, that's enough.